Hello and welcome back, and that's right, today I want to do an IP camera comparison. Today I want to talk about two very special cameras, two cameras that really left a mark on me in terms of what you are getting for your money, but also the way IP cameras are changing. And today I want to talk about the Reolink Duo 2 dual lens camera, and I want to talk about the Annke FCD600 dual lens camera. Now these are two very similar solutions, but even though they are both approaching the idea of a dual lens 180-degree coverage camera, they've gone about it in presentation and in what you get for your money in actually slightly different ways. And I think a number of you who are looking at upgrading your home surveillance or looking for a single camera and you don't really want to muck around with panning and tilting, and you just want a fixed camera that has the widest possible coverage area, are looking at these two cameras for your setup and wondering, which one's worth my buns? And that's what today's video is about. We're going to be going through the design, we're going to be going through the specifications, we're going to be going through the features, and we're going to deep dive into the software, both mobile and desktop, for both of these cameras to help you decide which one's best for you. And that's the key point. This isn't about which one's best, because I can tell you that right now, neither one of these cameras completely wins. Both of them have got their own strengths and weaknesses that will appeal to you, the end user, and your setup and your level of expertise. And that one's going to become particularly handy later on. It's not just about the quality of the picture, although that will play a part. It is about a whole range of variables that will make one of these better suited to your needs more than the other. But that's enough of the old intro, isn't it? Let's get down to the meat and potatoes, shall we? So, price-wise, they're very similar. Both of these cameras represent kind of, in terms of the surveillance industry, they're definitely not the heavy hitters, your Axis there at the top, but they're definitely not the lowest of the low. They are providing affordable, feature-rich cameras to consumers. Not just, obviously not enterprise, high-end industry, but definitely your SMB, your small medium business, your Soho user there, your small home office type, and of course prosumers and just home users that want a camera front and back. Now, they both knock around to about the $120, $130, all up to about $150 mark, with prices on their own websites as well as on sites like Amazon fluctuating during flash sales and deals. So again, about $130 to $150 shopping around. Very similar pricing there. So straight away, what about the build quality of both of these? I'll tell you right now, between the two of these, I would say that the Reolink camera feels more solid, I will say. It's a combination of metal and plastic, whereas the Annke is almost completely plastic. Now, that doesn't make too much of a difference in terms of water ingress, I will say, because both of these cameras are IP66 rated, and indeed the only cavities on the camera for each of them that I could find is just there on the base of each camera with regards to a speaker point there on the base, hopefully tilting that in the light. And even then, that's facing down the whole time. I apologise for the noise these cables are definitely going to make when they're rubbing against the cable, right against the table. I will say that this feels meatier, this camera. It's weightier, I think, ever so slightly, despite it being all plastic versus this being a combination plastic metal chassis design. I'll say of the two of them, this one I reckon is going to get more attention. So if you want that camera to be noticed there in the background, it's going to be this one. This has got something of a kind of mixture of short circuit Wally kind of design there between them. If we do this so the cables don't touch the screen too much there, this is kind of what you're going to be seeing there. And indeed, they both say that they support 180-degree coverage, but height does play a part, with the Reolink camera having around 60 degrees, I believe, of height coverage in terms of degrees, whereas the Annke covering something in the region of 81 degrees between the two of them there. So between the two of them, I'd say build quality wise, the Reolink pips it ever so slightly. Just that combination design there, but not by too much. It's fairly standard. In terms of the look of things, this looks probably better as a surveillance camera. This looks a little bit out there in terms of its design for some users. Now, Now, in terms of picture quality, the Annke is rated at 6 megapixel, and that's a 3632 by 1632 resolution max settings, 20 frames per second. The Reolink is rated at 4608 by 1728 resolution on an 8 megapixel lens at 20 frames per second. Remember, that is spread across the whole field of view, by the way. Those ratings across the lenses, they're very, very important indeed. Now, what that means is when you're covering your 108 degrees, and again, I know you're watching this, RJ, over to you, thank you so much for pointing this out. When it comes down to the coverage, when you've got that whole area being viewed, pixel count is king, more so than anything, because the minute you start having to zoom in, because just because you've got 100 degrees of coverage, that's just more area where at one point you're going to have to zoom in on an intruder or an incident. So if you don't have the highest possible pixel count, the more you zoom, the worse the picture is going to get. Neither of these are optical zoom cameras. Optical zoom would be impossible on a dual lens design. It wouldn't work. It would be like one of your eyes focusing weird. It would have to be about digitizing the actual feed that you've got there. So because of that higher pixel count and resolution of the highest maximum rate, we got to give this to the Reolink there in terms of overall coverage. When we're zooming in, you'll see this later on, how the two play side by side despite very similar specifications. Just that extra oomph that the Reolink has does result in a better overall feed presented to you when you're zooming in. In terms of recording there, one weird area of difference between these two, one of two particular weird areas of difference, and that is to do with the output. Now, the Reolink outputs 8.265 or HEVC, the more compressive file format in terms of, compressing a file afterwards for ingest, recording, and export. However, the Annke supports both H.264 and 265. Now, why is that important? Because if you're using a device that doesn't have support of HEVC, and again, it's not as much of a barrier as it was, but it is still on some devices, or if you are going to be a user that's going to be accessing via a particular web browser or using a particular kind of outlet client system, you may hit some barriers there, and having the flexibility for your recordings to be in 264 or 265 may be desirable to you. So I'm kind of surprised. Maybe it's an efficiency of the components they're going for and the preset defaults on the chips inside, but having that varied degree of saving output may benefit some users, and obviously both of them allow you to kind of scale the recording quality. Again, more on that later on, but the Annke does give you a better scope of doing so. But I like the fact that the Annke has a more varied support there in terms of file compression overall. That said, when it comes to NAS utilization, because I've tested both these cameras with NAS, and there's been variable results. First and foremost, with the Annke, it is NAS supported, sorta. Now, by that, what I mean is, by default, it isn't. You can't just pop it in and it's picked up on Viv like a lot of cameras and you're fine. You actually have to go into the settings a little bit more. Annke have published some guides on this, and you will have to enable a few things within the settings there of OnVid, maybe even encrypted network protocol, depending on the way your NAS is set up, in order for it to be seen. And then it's the fact that it's two lenses. Now, this at the moment, in the default state, enabling some of the options I've mentioned, does not make it appear as one feed. It still identifies both of the lenses, which can be a problem for licensing. Now, at launch, the Duo did that same thing, but now, fast forwarding to current times, not only can you now utilize this device in a single camera license for both of those cameras in the feed, but on top of that, it is still picked up immediately there. Disconnector found there on the heating. It is picked up across surveillance station in that one license and over OnVid by default. Now, you may not like that OnVid's on by default on this camera for a security reason, but I think a lot of easier users that just want to set up conveniently are going to like that, and that's a big takeaway moving forward from this, because one thing these two cameras do very, very differently is control, because the Reolink, as you'll see later in the video, is a lot more chewable friendly in terms of its options. It's not by any means easy peasy, there's still configuration, but the level of configuration and the way it's presented to you is a lot more user friendly, if a little more limited. Whereas the Annke one gives you insane levels of customization and control and network protocol and configuration and even lens control, light control, saturation control, aperture control, all of those things. But when it is presented to you in this camera, man alive, if you don't know what you're doing, it'll be very easy for you to knacker this up and hope to God that clicking that default button isn't just going to undo the last 6 hours of work. And that's my point between these two cameras. They've gone a very different way. Another way in which they've gone very, very different, of course, is connectivity, because the Annke camera is available as both a bullet and a turret form of camera, and both of these are PoE, power over Ethernet there, and there's actually a varied degree of different connected options with this camera, which is really, really impressive in terms of, again, going slightly above and beyond the noob user and into a far more configurable utilization. But what you must have noticed by now is that the Reolink camera has got Wi-Fi antennae. That's right. This system actually arrives in several different configurations. There is a Wi-Fi model that again means that you, of course, are going to have to attach power. You're going to need a mains outlet there. Or there is a version of this camera that is PoE only, that doesn't have those aerials on it. And then, of course, you've got your PoE power. And then finally, you've got a version of the camera where you can actually attach a detachable battery pack onto this to keep it an official battery pack for this. And again, it's the same camera, but with different kinds of power and network connectivity there, whether it's going to be wired or unwired there. Now, again, it's going to be very different based on your own setup, which one's more desirable. But I like the fact that there's a few different ways to deploy this camera listed on Reolink's own website in different configs, whereas the Annke seems to be very rigid to that wired domain there. In terms of the actual lenses themselves, we're not going to delve into the CMOS because, frankly, if I try starting to describe half versus 1.2 type CMOS and aperture and lens, I don't know enough about that personally to give you an informed opinion. I can only really show you the feeds that they present. I will say that in terms of spotlights and overall IR sensors on this, there are more on the Reolink there. You've got 6 individual IRs and for the infrared and depth and night vision, and then you've got individual spotlights there up to 560 lumens across 8 different spotlights. This has quite a bright spotlight and IR pattern on it, but nowhere near as comprehensive as that as we saw during the recording there. Indeed, during our recordings when we had these cameras running a little bit too similar, this picked up on the excessive IR on that during our night vision test, which is a bit annoying, by the way, but it still just went on to indicate just how many extra sensors there are on the front mount of this camera. But moving back to what you're getting for your money, we'll talk a little bit about about AI, something we'll talk about later in this video when we go through a lot of the configuration of this software. But I would say, although both of them are rolling out with that slightly rudimentary AI detection inbuilt. What I mean by that is, of course, vehicle license plate registration, facial recognition, and keeping a database on there. None of that's going to be included. What you do get is person recognition, vehicle recognition, pet recognition, I think in beta in one case or one of these two, and you get general kind of identifiable markers, meaning that if you do have 100 alerts and you only want to look out for a pre-select one, you only want to look at your feeds on security incursions or any kind of recorded feed or snapshot, and you only want to focus on ones that are on a given subject of person, vehicle, etc., then you can use that to whittle those down, motion control and more. But the Annke is one step further, because whereas the Reolink only has that person, animal, vehicle, motion, and a few things like colour, night vision and stuff like that, we think they both roll out in one shape or form. But in the case of the Annke also has line detection. It has intrusion detection, and it's also got entrance and exit level line detection. And indeed, as you'll see later on in the video, when we ran the software, whereas the Reolink allows you to see the feed and you can actually add the little red boxes if you dig in deep enough for identification, in the case of the Annke, you can run so many more simultaneously. You can run multiple instances of each of those individual tailored intelligent notifications, but also on the individual feed. When you're looking at this camera, the whole 180 feed, you can choose, if you wish, to see all of the implementations on screen. So not just see the alerts, but if you've drawn lines of entrance and exits, if you've drawn regions of interest, if you have drawn areas where you need to know if there is not so much loitering, but people moving in or out of, you can see all that in a single feed with all the diagrams on screen, which I think for certain surveillance enthusiasts that want to be able to see the nature of their alerts if a camera is moving or moving in the wind is going to be very advantageous. But it's just another example of how these two brands have gone a very different road. But that's enough of the old yappity yap here on screen. Let's get the software on screen and start comparing these two of what you get for your money. So taking a look now at the Reolink web interface, this is what you see when you log in via that web URL, the IP number that you've got there that you're going to be accessing. This is Chrome I'm running here, and this is the camera running with the full fluidity there, with the resolution at the highest state, the frame rate at 20 frames per second, and the bit rate. And as you may have already seen, I don't know quite how this is going to edit in terms of timeline, we've already done the kind of local recording and what we see when we use the client-side recording there. So from here, we can do pretty much everything you would expect. We've got the ability to sort of play it and pause it there. On the right-hand side of the screen there, we've got the usual stuff to take local images there, center it and get rid of that image there on the back, and more stuff there if you want to switch between different players. But of course, Flash Player, let's not even talk about that. So the general controls you've got there to do with the image stitching, we've already kind of recorded some stuff showing the breakpoint there in the middle between the image stitching, but you can change that on the fly in the web browser. And you can change a lot of the, preset recording patterns, or switch between the fluent one as well, or if you want higher, kind of lower latency, I should say, then you can lower that. But you can control a modicum amount of things there. And of course, you can change some of the stuff to do with, the output of the brightness and stuff like that. You can change a lot of this stuff here on the fly if you want to, and then reset it very, very quickly. In terms of the advanced setting there, just basically the localized output is really all you've got. But what you can also do from the web browser interface there is go through the options. Now, get used to seeing this, because when we cross over to the client application, you're going to see quite a lot of crossover there. If you have a little look, you've got the options to change the name, the watermark, that sort of thing. You've got those streaming patterns, as we mentioned earlier on, which one you want to go for first as a default, and a few extra options with regards to changing stuff with the interframe rates. The alarm settings there, how and when you want the detection settings to be changed around with, and the object settings if you want to change something in the local environment to utilize as a kind of perspective. But it doesn't look like we're getting that there, presumably because we're accessing this feed in 3 different ways, including the mobile right now. And you've got the controls there, quite user-friendly, I would say, in terms of changing the audio and lighting. I really want you to take on board the way things are presented in this Reolink interface here, both on the web browser and the client. Later on, when we're comparing both the Annke and the Reolink approach here. More information there. Then you've got the recording settings, localized patterns, that sort of thing, and of course the triggers is something we would have set up earlier on. Then of course you've got the network settings there, fairly standard stuff, and you can add other Wi-Fi networks if you're using a Wi-Fi camera, but of course a lot of you are going to be running PoE. And then you've got the storage management there, very limited, you can't really do much more than format it there. And then you've got the changing of the individual camera settings there as well. Then the playback settings there, it's worth highlighting. As you can see, some things have to change when you're flicking in the web browser mode with regards to support of different codecs and players within the web browser. This is some of that night vision stuff that we've been running there on the camera. So what we want to do is just flick over to some current recordings there. Maybe go to like the now recordings there. Maybe some of the captured records there when I was wandering around the garden like an idiot, getting ready for this recording. And of course, that's really it. The frame rate is obviously going to be not as good as you might like when you're accessing it in this fashion. What I will say is things do up their game quite significantly when we make our way over to the client for the PC. So if we move over to the PC client here, and there is our live view. Obviously what we were looking at before was a single camera interface there, but what we could do from here, it's the wrong client, if we go to the Reolink client there, using this app, which is for the PC. And do you know what, while we're doing this, it might be quite useful to periodically have a look at the task manager there, just to see how much resources are being used. Obviously, we're running OBS at the same time, and we've got the Guardian app running at the same time. We're able to see that the, let's go for it, the Reolink application isn't being too exhaustive. I mean, definitely compared to the likes of Chrome. And the application here running, This is where we're going to see a little bit more fidelity there, and obviously if your system has support of an HEVC license or H.265 support, then you're going to see things a little clearer there in terms of the compressed output you're seeing. But if you wanted to and you had multiple cameras, you can go ahead from this interface here and start adding more cameras, either remotely or on the local IP, and create your larger command deck. Now the live view is much the same. The controls very, very simple there at the bottom. You want to take a snapshot, you take a snapshot, you want to take a local video, etc. Turn on the spotlight, activate the siren, have audio in and out. And they've also got this really cool feature that I've not had a chance to fully test, but this allows you to have the camera set up to record for a given period of time, and then it will speed up that footage and add certain filters and effects, and then it will ultimately create hours of footage compressed into seconds or minutes for a brief overview. It's a lovely little feature. I don't think I would ever use it personally, but I think a lot of people who have got hours and, hours, days, maybe even weeks of footage they need to comprise down, or even just for, pro editing, that might be quite nice. But it's quite a fanciful feature in the grand scheme of things. And you've got the usual stuff, changing the volume, full screen, that sort of thing, flicking between available feeds, refresh. If you want to go to the playback features, it's much like we saw earlier, but I think there's a better degree of control thanks to that rather rudimentary AI support. So, for example, if we want, and we flick over to the day recordings, and we say we only want to see the alert of where people have occurred, then that is what it will show us. So if we want to, we can flick out to a different day. So if we flick over to today instead, we're able to see it's now got highlighted there the incidence of when a human has appeared on those filters. So if we go in and we can increase the play speed there. If we choose to, we can go just interpolastic frame by frame. As you can see, it clocked that a human was going through those, and that's a really handy little feature when, if you remove that and we just enable everything down to motion, all of a sudden it adds all of these brand new recognized alerts. So it's nice to be able to see all of this and then go, do you know what, I literally just want to see the ones where it was a person or see the ones where it was a vehicle. So that's quite a nice little feature to have in there. It's not going to, win awards, but it's nice to have it in this user-friendly way. And I think that is going to be the word that we're going to keep coming back to here, user-friendly. Again, very similar to what we saw earlier on. There's only a few extra details included in this compared with what we saw on the web client there. I would say overall the main differences you're going to get in this, obviously the options that are dedicated to the client application, but you do get a lot more general information included here on the client side to play with, but presented in a little bit more of a chewable, user-friendly fashion. And even the client side application has just light stuff about where things are going to be recorded, whether you want to use decode, encode, etc. And just general stuff, but it's just nice to have those extra options there. And again, this is kind of something we've talked about before, about there is a slight lack of cohesion across the Reolink applications, mobile to desktop to browser, but they do still maintain a user-friendly standard across all three. And so over to the Annke side of things. And one of the earliest takeaways you'll find when you're dealing with the Annke software is it kind of lacks a lot of the modernization of that Reolink application we were running there. Now, I've got the cameras running at the highest possible quality here. So what you're immediately seeing when we're playing it via the browser is there's that drop in frame rate. And we will be making our way over to their desktop application, the client application in a moment. But I just wanted to, like for like compare against that Reolink there. So first thing I will say is it looks a little bit more dated. Indeed, when we're looking at the layout there, it's definitely a little older school. You are going to need to download that plugin very early doors in order to run some of the in-screen stuff there. If you go to the configuration option there, we can have a little look about some of the layout options. There's pretty much everything you would expect. Apologies for the lawnmower going off somewhere nearby in a accompanying garden. I will say that the configuration options are deeper on the browser. You can definitely configure a heck of a lot more here on the Annke side of things than you could on that Reolink application. There's just way more configuration options, internal maintenance, internal recording, even changing a lot of the aperture of the camera and stuff like that. There's a lot more for us to play with here on the Annke side of things. Now, that means if you know what you're doing and you really want to tinker around with the camera, then there's a lot to like here. There's a lot to configure, a lot to tweak. But with that comes obviously the slight danger that you might over tweak and back yourself into a quite horrific corner. Take, for example, the display settings here. This is probably one of the most detailed ones I've gone for here. And one of the issues I encountered, of course, was when I was looking at the day-night switching. There's a tremendous degree of configuration with the day-night switching on the Annke software. And of course, it is going to depend on the camera you use. It isn't just going to be this dual lens ones we're using here. But still, the idea, there wasn't just the auto switch or day or night. There was the scheduled switch. So you can force the camera, if you wish, to go to day or night mode there. Of course, when I was running the two cameras side by side, we did see some infrared light conflict there. But still, just the option that we've got lots of configuration of both the floodlight or the IR sensors. A lot of people are going to like that, but at the same time, if you don't know what you're doing, you're going to be tapping that default button a lot. The same goes for the image quality and everything that you want to configure in the background. Even the alerts. If we go back to that Reolink IP camera, I'm going to log in there simply because I didn't want to have it running while I had that live view running there in the background, because it was just too much bandwidth consumption overall running over a 1 gig network. So what I'm going to do is just very quickly switch over to the sub quality camera. So again, this isn't the usual quality, this is the sub stream. So the sub stream feed is much lower, so don't judge the camera on that, but I'm only flicking to that. So when we go through the configuration tool, we're not overburdening the bandwidth there and causing oversaturation. But the point I'm making is, if you go into the Reolink application in the web browser, the abilities to change, stuff like a lot of the triggers aren't as good. It's still nice that you've got those configurations, and they've certainly kept it light, free and easy, but with the detection settings there, as good as they were for setting up those detection zones and stuff like that, and again, we'd have to enable the plugin there in the background to see that, just generally, the options weren't, although they're a lot more chewable and user-friendly. When we look at the Annke one, although it's a little dated looking, not only can we configure to an expert mode or to a standard mode, but on top of that, with video tampering, with a lot of the other smart events, we just have a lot more that we can do. So for example, in the smart effects, we can use a lot of those rudimentary AI services, start drawing that line detection, drawing the region detection, and all of that stuff there in the background that we might want to do, and run multiple of those, all of them on the same feed there indeed. When we look at the user interface here, utilizing the camera generally, and I'm trying to use the right one here, I believe it is basic information. In the maintenance tab, one of these, user management, we've effectively got the option, and I showed it on a previous video, that you can change what you can see. So for example, if we go back to that live view, yes, we can see this feed. Remember, this is the live feed we're watching here on the lower substream, that it's going to load up that secondary lower stream quality there. And again, we can set up, if we had patrol patterns on a pan tilt zoom, we could have configured them there. But this is the lower quality substream rather than the primary. But on the desktop application there, you can see all those blue boxes. This is where we've set up all of our alert triggers. This allowed us to be able to set up all of these individual things and to be able to see them on an overview without tapping into each of them. You can enable that, I should say, here on the Annke window to view those lines and guidelines here on the display on the web browser. But that kind of, if anything, adds even further into the larger degree of management that's required on their platform, because a lot of the configuration options, and I wish there was an easy button that you could just click in order to have a lot of these options just immediately activated, rather than having to navigate a lot of these options by in a forced with no actual choice there in the background. You definitely have an enormous range of control on the Annke platform with their user interface in the web browser, but for some users that is actually going to be too much and very kind of overarching level of control. But if you want to be able to control the feed remotely without using a mobile app or a desktop client on the fly, this is certainly going to be beneficial to you. Now, Playback in the browser window, very straightforward indeed. So we can just go ahead and play whatever this recording is here. Let's just select that recording there, why not, just somewhere. And from here, we don't really have that same level of AI surfaced. Let's go back, actually. I just realised what we did wrong there. For us to play one of these files, we'll have to go into the correct date, get that playing there. And we're not really getting that responsiveness, are we? And again, this may be related to codecs there in the browser. So this might be a perfect time for us to make our way over here to the application. So if we go over to the app, and again, actually, sorry, just before I do that, I should also highlight when we go back to the preview, just in case you're worried about bandwidth consumption, we can see even on the fluent playback is not allowing us to do fully clear because the bandwidth is oversaturated. It still feels like it's running at a better quality there. And if we look at the substring quality settings, let's go into them there. They're, you know, still reasonable stats when we compare them against that of the live view there on the Annke feed. The more complex feed and perhaps the less browser optimized feed by comparison, because you're certainly feeling those lags, feeling those slight delays there in the background. And of course, their substream is actually lower than that of the Reolink one we're watching there. So the Reolink one still feels like it's being a lot more responsive, a lot more fluid as well. If we do some zooming in as well at some point. But ultimately, it just feels slightly better. And even though this has been lowered in its overall quality, it's still not looking as smooth as this one. And again, we're not talking about resolution because it is still a higher resolution. But what I'm talking about there is the bitrate and the frame rate on both of these is now running at the same 20 frames. But it's just struggling bandwidth-wise, presumably because of a poorer browser optimization by comparison. Now, making our way back over to that of that Guardian Vision, we can take a little look there about how it's played with here on a desktop client. And I'd say with a desktop client, things, if anything, get even more complex. This is certainly an enterprise-grade tool. This could really do with some modernization, and I know on their website they have some vision applications for desktop clients that do look a lot plusher, but the desktop client is just, if you don't know what you're doing, this takes some time. There is pretty much options to configure and control everything about your camera surveillance setup. I am not going to fault it for its utilization of configuring the camera and controlling the camera, but I will say it certainly lacks a lot of the kind of modern twists that we might like, and this feels very Windows 8.1 in its user interface here. And a lot of the controls, I would say, even go as far as to say they are kind of Windows XP in their presentation. You can do everything within here, but at the same time, although you can do everything here and you add all of these configuration options, luckily not all of them are enabled by default because you'd lose a good 40% of the screen. What it lacks in modernization, it gains just in sheer weight of functionality. Once again, if we compare it against that Reolink application we were looking at, yes, it runs more efficiently, it runs a lot smoother, it's a lot more responsive, I would say, overall, but it does that by being a little lighter on the features compared with that of the Annke. So it's really what you're going to be looking for overall in your user interface and control. If you want true configuration of the cameras and, you know, enjoying it at the highest quality and optimizing it perfectly to your needs, you're going to enjoy that Annke UI a little bit more. But if you want something that's easy, intuitive, straightforward, and a little bit more modern to the touch, you're definitely going to prefer the Reolink one. Moving over to the mobile applications, we're looking here at the Android Play or Google Play shop. Here we can see on the left the Reolink app and on the right the Annke app. Now, the score does seem to be higher on the Annke app there, I will say, but there have been more downloaded on the Reolink. We're not really going to gauge and review these too harshly based on those metrics. So there's just not a lot to go with there. But I will say that overall the complaints are pretty free-flowing and quite consistent across the two of them with regards to its either camera access or bit rates. Now, Coming out, we can go into the Reolink app here on the left-hand side, and it immediately loads into the last camera we were in, and the same goes for the Annke one when it opens up. Now, both of them allow you to get a nice live view, either remotely or via the local area network. The left-hand one there, you can see we can span both of them over the 180 degrees. I will say that the zoom is obviously coming out just a little bit blurrier there on the Reolink one between the two of them. The control panel seems a little bit more ready there on the Annke on the right-hand side of the screen there. You've got the usual options that you would expect to be able to, zoom into areas. The ability to take localized screenshots there. If you rotate the camera, obviously that's not going to play very well on what we're doing here. And you've got the usual control system there. I will say it's a little bit more simplified there on the Reolink one, whether it is that you're looking at older or newer generation recordings there. So by that I meant obviously stuff that's pre-recorded and stuff that's being recorded live. I would say when it comes to playback, things are a lot more intuitive on the Reolink, but I will say the control deck on the Annke is arguably a little bit better between the two of them there. Another thing I will highlight with the Annke, just managing that playback just feels a little clunkier. You can see it there on the right hand side of the screen. The retrieval, even though both of these are accessing a camera on the same local area network, so we're not even using remote access, things just seem a little bit more snappier and responsive there on the Reolink compared with the Annke application side by side. The information's there, whether you're going to, as you can see, event playback or just general all-time recorded playback. But it seems a little bit more intuitive, at least on the older recordings on the Reolink than the Annke. I will say the configuration options also feel a little bit more intuitively placed on the Reolink one. You can see on the left-hand side of the screen, as I'm slowly but surely navigating through all of the different settings that are afforded to you on either of these applications. You can see on the left-hand side on the Reolink app that things just a little clearer. They're taking up less real estate there on screen. They're a little bit less squished in. And on the right-hand side of the screen, you will see the settings menu navigated on the Annke application. There's a little bit more of a comparison there. Things just seem a little bit more user-friendly there on the Reolink app, and it's quite comparable to that of the client application from Reolink. You can see from the right hand side of the screen as we're going through some of those historical recordings there, you can see the retrieval did maintain a kind of slightly slower access. Now if we go to the settings, just to make a comparison there, the Annke one, although there isn't a lot of options there, it's the structure of them I'm less keen on. So for example, as you can see there, we've got the kind of baseline ones with regards to general access, and a lot of those services are limited to what you're seeing on the app. But at the bottom there, you've got an option called web configuration, and that web configuration tool is how you configure a lot of the settings of the camera. And although the majority of these options are quite informative, I'm not going to say they are presented particularly user-friendly for the novice. The Reolink one on the left is just giving you enough information and giving you a lot of kind of visual information as well to manage the device a lot more, and it just feels a little bit more modern and intuitive compared to that of the Annke. Now the Annke counters this by giving you supreme customization via the app. The Reolink application doesn't give you anywhere near the customization and the configuration options open to you in the Annke one. Now whether that's good or bad to you, whether you think that's just an oversaturation of information that's being presented to you with regards to customization, configuration, alerts and more, I think if you want to be able to configure your camera a great deal using the mobile application, then you're probably going to find the Annke application just giving you a lot more to play with. Whereas the Reolink one there, although it does give you great options and they are presented very, very well indeed, with lots of visual prompts and clues, there definitely is a lacking comparative amount of control afforded to you on the Reolink application compared to what you're seeing there on the Annke one there. Again, for good or for bad. There was the odd visual hiccup, as you can see there on the right hand side, because the camera was trying to be accessed while I was screen recording. But we're not going to penalise it too much for that, because that's more to do with my screen recording. But you also had a better degree of control over events, and given both of these cameras advertise kind of human, car and pet recognition, as well as the smart events that are exclusive to the Annke one, that line crossing detection, regional detection, intrusion, that kind of stuff. Being able to configure those on the mobile app is going to be quite desirable to a lot of users out there. It's not perfect, but it's definitely better on there than I've seen in a number of web applications before. And it does afford a lot of those access points that we've seen on the desktop client application from Annke to be available there on their mobile app. It's a lot of information, but it presents it quite well, I would say. With the Reolink app continuing to be very straightforward and user-friendly, although a little less feature-rich than the Annke one overall. And that's something we saw repeated time and time and again when we were looking about both of these applications and the settings that each one of them presented to the end user accessing via the desktop client or the mobile the browser client. Now, moving forward, we've got here two recordings captured utilizing each of their respective cameras, and this was testing the visual zoom options open. Both of them were accessed using the client applications from both Reolink and Annke. I'd say the smoothness of them is obviously going to be somewhat limited to both of them utilizing a digital zoom. I'd say obviously on the bottom right we've still got those AI boxes that we enabled earlier on. And I'd say even though both of these have been captured using both of their respective applications and played within, I think overall I would say the clarity seems just a little bit better on the Reolink overall on that spectrum of field of view there. It's a little sharper I think in places, and the colour balance isn't quite as good on the Annke one. We're looking at these side by side using the default settings, and again of course you could use the Annke application to tailor a lot of those settings, but if you're looking at utilising these and using that digital zoom afforded to both of them, using the default settings, and you don't want to dick around and play with the settings, you're probably going to find that Reolink just a little bit easier, a little clearer overall, particularly when we're zooming in on the cat there. I think that cat does come across a little bit clearer overall between the two of them. Remember, both of these were recorded less than an hour apart, so we can't even really blame the time of day. And you can just make out on the right hand side of the screen every time I zoom out on the Reolink just how close these two cameras were, because you can see the Annke camera just on the edge of the field of view of that Reolink camera as we're testing those zooms over and over again within these two fields. Now we will test another bit of recording pattern from both of these side by side in a moment, but I think between these two I think we can agree that although both of them have got slightly jerky zooms, because obviously we're screen recording while it's doing both of them, overall the Reolink probably did a better job of the colours, whereas the Annke just seemed a little sharper there. But again, that may have been the AI boxes causing just a minor conflict while we were testing these zooms time and time again. We'll move over to our next test in a moment as we come out of this. Now, this was utilising the web browser. And this was showing with standard settings accessing both of these cameras over the local area network how the camera feed in terms of frames per second recorded me utilising both of these in a web browser walking in front of the camera. Now ignore the field of view insofar as the angle, because the Reolink is slightly higher up between the two of them. But remember, this is using maximum settings on both cameras, as you can see on the bottom right of each feed, and me walking in front of the camera both times accessed via the web browser. So using Google Chrome with nothing else running in the background just to see how smooth it was. And I think the Reolink is clearly doing a better job of maintaining that bitrate while I'm walking in front of these cameras. They're both running at 20 frames per second at the maximum resolution supported by both cameras. But whereas the Reolink is running quite smooth, the Annke there, and remember both of these were running at H.265, even though you've got the option of both. I made sure that they were both using H.265. It's just a little jumpier on the Annke overall between the two of them, because remember we are still looking at two cameras here that have been stitched together over 180 degrees. If you look closely, you'll just see the line, the slight bump between the two of them as I go across the stitching line between the two. But overall, I'd still say it was a lot smoother there on the Reolink rather than the Annke. But of course, that was web browser access. This wasn't native, and it wasn't using the camera's own recording, but merely a feed via the web browser, a very distinct difference. Now, this was using the two recordings of the camera's own feeds. Downloaded, not played via the web browser. These are the original recordings maintained and achieved from the cameras, and immediately we see a distinct difference there. We can see the Annke camera there is now running significantly smoother between the two of them. Ignore that slight blip on the screen, that's to do with the OBS, but I would say that the Annke feed is sharper. I would say the Reolink one is slightly jumpier in its recording there, and again that might be OBS, but I'd say I'm coming out a lot clearer in the Annke feed, and I also think the transition between the two lenses is a little bit more seamless with the stitching in the middle. If we're looking at the Annke feed, watch me go through the middle of the screen, you can barely make it out, but on the Reolink you can definitely see the slight ripple as I move between the stitching point between both of these camera lenses. And I think another thing this proves is kind of a lot more about the Reolink camera just being a better all-round access, but the Annke is in its element, not only when you're accessing its own recorded feeds rather than a browser which may lack optimization, but also in terms of its customization and configuration while you're utilizing it there. And between the two of them, I think the Annke has proven itself a little bit more when we're accessing it via its native recordings and via its native apps than during the web browser. And the Reolink just seems to be a better all-round package when it comes to being able to access it via a multitude of different means and get the most seamless experience. There's still, as you can see there with the Reolink app, a little jumpy, but still pretty good overall. I think time and time and again throughout this entire video, if there's one mainstay point I have made comparing these two, it's just that this, the Reolink, is the more accessible camera, and one that I think a lot of everything from the home up to the small business are going to enjoy using. And if you don't want to spend a lot of time configuring your camera, if you don't want to have to wade through a lot of technical jargon in order to get it ready and set up for your own network and rely on a lot of defaults, you're going to enjoy using the Reolink. The Annke, on the other hand, gives you a degree of control way beyond that of the Reolink. Maybe too much for some users, but certainly a level of customization that allows you to set this camera up in a far more precise manner in terms of coverage and picture quality for your setup that this doesn't offer you, and the level of customization over the network protocol and indeed the extra options it provides to you in terms of the supported intelligence services and intelligent detection dwarf that available on this Reolink here. The Reolink arrives arguably at the better and more customizable price with options such as that battery pack, the Wi-Fi option, or going PoE only in a way that this could probably stand to emulate, and that's something we see more and more again. The pixel density across what you're seeing I think is better on the Reolink overall for most users to enjoy, but the one that you're getting with the Annke is still pretty darn good. It's just some users may not be totally in love with the amount of configuration options that you may need to pursue, be it with connecting it to a NAS or NVR, or configuring the camera to your own setup to get the most out of it off the bat. But this has been comparing the Reolink Duo with the Annke FCD600. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. I'm going to pause for the thumbnail. Thank you very much for waiting on that. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, let me know in the comments. We've got lots of videos coming up on surveillance, along with a few podcast episodes and a few dedicated guides on both of these brands. So do check them out in the comments. But otherwise, thank you so much for watching. If you've got any questions or want some help choosing the right surveillance setup or camera or NAS setup for your needs, use the free advice section link below. Use the free community supported forum, Ask NAS Compares, use the Discord, or message me directly in the comments or on my email, which I'm fairly certain you can work out. It's my name at nascompares.com. Other than that, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.